if you don't feel like you're in a good rhythm within the conversation, to pivot to something that might anchor them back into, I know you, like I've been there, or whatever that might be. But it does take the effort on kind of my side up front to ensure that I'm going to plan for things to not go well in order to redirect the conversation. And I really need to get to know them, because I know I've been on the other end of it when someone shows up and if it almost feels like they don't care. And that might not be the case, but that's how I felt. And as we all know, it's really not kind of sometimes the words that you say, but it's how you made them feel. That is what stays with you. And so for me, the intent for any preparation is making sure that I would never do that to someone, because I value their time just as much as my own.
Your business's success depends on relationships with customers, relationships with employees, and relationships with stakeholders. What do they all have in common? They're all human. Because no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Welcome to the Human Connection Podcast. I'm your host, Karl Ponto. Each week I bring you stories, insights, and practical advice from experts that you can apply to your growing company and daily life. This week I'm excited to connect with Michael Crane. He is a sales, growth, and strategic partnerships leader at Talkiatry and a former firefighter, bringing a people-first mindset to his work. While his career path has evolved, his focus has remained the same, helping people when it matters most. At Talkiatry, he drives growth and builds strategic partnerships that expand access to mental health, healthcare. Known for his authentic, relationship-driven approach, Michael is passionate about connecting providers and patients with solutions that make meaningful impact. Congrats on helping people when it matters most, and welcome to the Human Connection Podcast.
Thank you for having me, Karl. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the show because there does seem to be like a lack of purpose or kind of focus beyond just like closing deals and the transactional side of things in sales and partnerships. And really the secret to success seems to be having more of that purpose and the relationship focus than a lot of people are operating with. So what have you found that works, and how do you build those sort of relationships when it comes to partnerships and sales?
Yeah, so I think, for me, my approach, if you asked me 15 years ago, when I still worked as a firefighter, would have been a completely different answer coming from a sports background. And it would have just been more along the lines of, how we show up. It really ties into the job. Then after, coming down with a blood clotting disorder and having to retire out after 5 years, for me, my answer now is, the way that I approach is leading with empathy, right? Like sharing a story, being willing to be vulnerable in order to allow folks to open up to share their stories if they're willing. I think it really frames up a different conversation when you're willing to lead with some of the lived experiences, whether good or bad, to allow folks to kind of anchor in a much quicker and deeper way, especially as we live in this virtual world. A lot of my meetings are just like this, right? It's a virtual conversation where you're trying to establish a relationship, and you're really just trying to figure out how we can best support the organization. When we're having conversations around virtual mental health, it can be very intimidating. There's still a lot of stigma around it. I know coming out of COVID and kind of the adaption of virtual care and all that has softened a bit, but there's still a lot of barriers there to make sure folks are comfortable with how we provide the services, answer some of those really fundamental questions to make them as comfortable as you can. So as I approach it, I just try and share my story, and I try and just kind of allow them to know that we're all going through something, right? And it's okay to kind of talk about that, because a lot of the folks I'm working with are really kind of the gatekeepers to open up access to patients, right? Their role is really to figure out who the right partnerships are, how that aligns with the organization, and where we best kind of fit into their strategy.
Yeah, I love that bit about the people you work with are the gatekeepers, and how it really is about building that trust with the people involved at the organization level, because especially in the today's world where last survey I heard about how much people trust big businesses and organizations is in the toilet. It's more and more important to have the relationships with the people involved in the business at the businesses, because you're able to trust them and get to have those relationships that can serve as a bridge to the transactional side of things, where if you're just considering it, oh, we're just trying to partner with this big organization, you're never able to build the trust in the same way as if you're, oh, we're connecting with the people involved and they have a relationship with us, and you get to understand how much you have in common beyond the industries you work in or the job titles. And those sorts of empathetic personal connections allow for the trust to be built, and then that makes the transactional side possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I will say even another silly example is the background in which I show up with, right? How you present yourself. So I sprinkle in things within my kind of backdrop, whether you're a golfer and you've played at Pinehurst, right? I have the flag behind me, a world map, if you want to talk about travel, pictures of the kids, a diploma, like just ways that as you connect, they can kind of, because everyone's doing this in this world now that we're not face to face, you're kind of scanning, right? Like, where can I find this connection? And since, the former for me was everything that I did was responding to folks that are really, in the greatest need that they can be, whether it's a medical emergency or a fire. And now I'm trying to build relationships really out of thin air. So you have really those first couple minutes to kind of validate who you are, what you do, with a few sentences, and then it's really like their observation around you and how quickly you can build that trust that will kind of carve out that path forward, or it'll really kind of shut down the conversation to where there's a lot more conversations that need to happen in order to kind of find that common ground to work together.
Yeah, I think it's especially in the virtual meetings, having the right questions to ask and being curious, and like when we've hopped on the call here, I used to ask people how you doing, but everyone just goes fine and you move on, and it's like that you don't really learn anything, and it's kind of a placeholder formality. Whereas I've made it a habit to ask people what the highlight of their week's been so far, because that really gets people thinking about, one, it puts them in a better mood because they're thinking about the good things that have been going on, and also when they share about what they're most excited about, whether it's a work-related thing or a family-related thing or just a life-related thing, then it gives insights into who they are, and you can find that common ground in ways that you wouldn't if you're just going through the motions on the personal side of things just to get to the transactional purpose of the meeting. And it's funny, I've had a number of people on the podcast before that talked about how important, even in like meetings with team members, just to have 10 minutes of small talk before the jumping into a meeting agenda, or having little personal conversations with people, like prospects that are calling your business. There's a owner of a law firm who has his people answering his phone, just listen and ask questions for 10 minutes instead of trying to sell anything, and just hear people, what they're saying, and respect them as human beings first. And that those things that seem like they're the first things that get cut when people are trying to go faster and faster and faster are the ones that are actually enabling the rest of the business operations to succeed, because it's providing that personal connection that is necessary to build trust.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's such a good call. And I think having, from my sales background, it's those open-ended questions, right? You want to avoid the yes, no, because then quickly the conversation can be very short and probably not in your favor. So it's, the curiosity, but I also think it's the energy you bring, right? I think for me, like, by nature, like I just love smiling. Like I'm happy, like it's exciting to meet people, all those things, but just if whether someone couldn't see me, like you can feel that if you're on a phone call as well, right? You can tell if the other person's smiling, you can tell if they're in a bad mood. So the way that you ask that question, I think, allows the individual to personalize that, which then just gives the gateway to the conversation, which is such a unique way to just kind of open up the conversation versus, oh, how was your weekend? What's the weather like? Oh, where do you sit? Like those are so generic that you can tell, like, okay, you really don't care, but to kind of ask intentionally, or like what's the highlight of your week, gets a lot deeper, a lot faster. That allows also a different aspect of my brain to respond versus the lazy side that is like, it's fine, it's good, right? Like You get that a lot too. So you definitely have to be mindful of like when you're stepping into these conversations with, especially when you're working in healthcare, you got a short amount of time with a lot of these leaders. You need to do something that stands out. And to your point, that type of question stands out because it is so much around time and how much can you do, how many emails and calls can you make, and that's how they define productivity versus I'd rather have 3 or 4 meaningful conversations within a day, even within a week, that drives the conversation forward versus 40 or 50 that really just kind of closed the door because it was so fast the other side felt it and it went nowhere.
Yeah, and I imagine you have some great examples. I know you might not be able to name names, but it's like what some of the times some of these great conversations you can share that like, and what made them stand out compared to the kind of templated interactions that so many people are operating with.
Yeah, so I think for me, every time I step into whether it's a clinical conversation, so for me, I have a light clinical background just from working as a firefighter, but it was never like a nurse, a doctor, a psychiatrist. So when I'm having those types of conversations, for me, I think it's important to frame up my experience within healthcare, lead with some vulnerability. So I share a personal story, right? Whether it's my retiring out because of injury or even deeper depending on kind of the body language that I'm kind of reading or the tone within the call, to kind of talk about something deeper around coming from like a military family, father, a failed suicide attempt, things that have gone on that really anchor into the why you're here. There's a lot of reasons to work within healthcare, maybe even a lot more around mental behavioral health. So I think when you can open up the door to defining your why, it really allows the other end to be like, I actually appreciate the honesty versus you're just here to sell me something. And then I think my experience has been when I'm able to do that in a way that is natural and not kind of forced or kind of catching someone off guard just to give them that like, oh wow, that's a lot, but just to really define that allows our conversation to really move in the direction it needs to, because every person that works within this space, virtual health, mental health, has a why. And sometimes it takes someone to kind of be vulnerable first to allow that, even as a reminder. If they've been working in the space for a while, you sometimes lose sight of that why. It's easy to do, but I think for me, that's where I found a lot of success. And then when you get that opportunity, like that's kind of your wedge in, right? Then you really have to deliver in terms of where the value with what you're discussing really lies. And if you're unable to do that, the conversation can quickly go right, back to, okay, there's really not a path forward. So I will say that's kind of my success stories have been around leading with some vulnerability, but then really being defined around why we're here to discuss whatever that problem is. And some of that is on me to do the due diligence in advance to understand the organization, understand some of their background. There's so many tools within, whether it's LinkedIn, I mean, you kind of name it. There's ways to kind of do your homework and prepare. There's nothing worse than someone hopping on a call. They have no idea who you are. They like it feels very like, oh, like, I'm sorry to bother you, right? And so I try and do everything that I can. I create kind of these opportunity documents that really just frame up a few different things about the individual that allows me to be curious, or if you don't feel like you're in a good rhythm within the conversation, to pivot to something that might anchor them back into, I know you, like I've been there, or whatever that might be. But it does take the effort on kind of my side up front to ensure that I'm going to plan for things to not go well in order to redirect the conversation. And I really need to get to know them, because I know I've been on the other end of it when someone shows up and it almost feels like they don't care. And that might not be the case, but that's how I felt. And as we all know, it's really not kind of sometimes the words that you say, but it's how you made them feel. That is what stays with you. And so for me, the intent for any preparation is making sure that I would never do that to someone, because I value their time just as much as my own.
Yeah, I love that what you said about preparing ahead of time to kind of show that you are interested in them and you're not just walking like, who are you again? And having the knowing them and helping them feel like you actually are interested in who they are, and can bring up things that are obviously not just your standard boilerplate questions that you might go through in a sales or a partnership conversation, because it is really telling if someone just asked this question. It's so much like it. You could have looked on their LinkedIn profile, or they could have looked up so many other things, like the question you're like, well, where you're from or whatever, is such a, like, that information is usually out there and easy to find. So if you don't even know that, or that's a question you default to, it's obvious you didn't look them up beforehand. And being able to show curiosity and show that you're interested in them, and then being able to also, like you said, be the one who shows vulnerability first, obviously not overdoing it. I think I was reading an article, like a post on LinkedIn today, about how vulnerability has kind of been like misappropriated, or kind of people go too far with it, and it becomes just like they are like taking overusing the idea, and it kind of dilutes its effectiveness in a way when people talk about being vulnerable. But having that openness and not trying to show up being super like putting up any facades, that sort of thing,
Yeah.
is really important, because people can tell when you're not really being honest or open or genuine. People can get a sense of the way you answer questions or just the body language. And so I love that your focus is on the other person and making them feel seen and understood, and having the sort of questions that can bring a conversation back that from going off the rails if you see that happening. And then it's stuff that, especially if you're building partnerships and even in like B2B sales, just closing the deal is not the end of the relationship. It's about having like the renewals and the longer term like engagement and delivery, all that stuff. But so often people think that, oh, and when we close the deal, like that's the end, that's the finish line, we can celebrate. It's like, no, you just started the next lap and you got to keep going. And so having those initial conversations where you're really showing interest and vulnerability are key for laying a strong foundation for a long-term business relationship and a personal relationship as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that. So it's a challenge to build a personal relationship out of a virtual introduction, although folks do it with a variety of dating apps and all that. Like, it leads to that in-person connection, right? I think to get away from being transactional into actually establishing a relationship is where you also allow the framework of the conversation for them to have the control over, like, saying no, right? And I think that's an important kind of opportunity that, again, it's really the tonality, the cadence within the conversation. You're trying to establish trust quickly. You're trying to establish credibility within how you can really support the organization because you understand their need. You also need to provide the space to listen and ask those thoughtful questions so you can truly make sure that, okay, like, I thought it was going to be this type of conversation from what I know about your organization, your role within that organization. Now I've actually heard something different. So I actually need to ask some other questions to make sure that I understand, because the last thing that you want to do, especially when, again, my role at Talkiatry, our goal is really to open up access for patients to have providers that can see them in a timely manner, right? Time to access is a huge component, but we also want to be very mindful of ensuring it's the right level of access, right? You don't want to just give some generic, hey, we have a provider that can see you, and it's not what the patient needs, right? So there's a lot to that, and I think it's such a good point to not come across as, okay, great, like, now we're partnered together, see you later, right? That can't exist, because if an organization is going to work with Talkiatry, our goal is to ensure that they have that continuity of care, they have that trust, that they can talk provider to provider to ensure that if they're going to refer a patient into our organization, they're going to get the highest level of care. And if they have questions, the door is always open to have that two-way communication, right? And so for me, when it comes to partnerships, I have to be very mindful of how we operate within the ecosystem of healthcare, health systems, within payers, to know how we fit and how we can kind of best support them. And also, it's so funny. I'm so clear up front too about, like, what we do and what we do not do. And I think that resonates more too, because sometimes people want to solve all the problems. And I think that's great. It probably comes from a genuine place, but it's really not helpful if that's not really the case. And so for us, we're great at virtual psychiatry, medication management, seeing patients 5 and above, seeing patients quickly, because we intentionally W-2 all of our providers to ensure that they are taken care of, their families are taken care of, which allows them to provide high quality care. I think for us too, it's so critically important to say, hey, we're great at these things. We don't do this. So that way they can look within the organization or externally to find the appropriate resource. Because I've worked at organizations in the past where you get so excited, you kind of get these sales ears that, oh, I heard this and we can solve all your problems. And if that's not the reality, the relationship is quickly going to take a turn when you have subsequent calls and some of that stuff really gets worked out. And so I think, again, you have your opportunity. They've taken the meeting, right? It's kind of your time to shine around building that rapport, but also being honest, because there's nothing worse than establishing a partnership or a friendship on kind of false terms in terms of, them thinking we can do a lot more than we can. And so I think that's also what's helped me too. I talk about my background, all those things, but also the honesty in what we do. And if you know anyone that's good at what they're looking for, provide the referral. Like we've talked a lot, Karl, about just the different connections within our own ecosystem of happy to introduce you. Like, let me do that for you, right? And I think that adds so much value that sometimes within healthcare and within sales in general, you have that stigma of, oh, you're just going to sell me anything. And some of that still exists. And I think for me, it's trying to shift the conversation around not these structured questions and this is how it has to go, but to just very conversational. But again, a lot of that starts with ensuring that I've done my homework to ensure I know who I'm stepping into a conversation with. And if I can't bring value, don't take up any more of their time, but try and be a resource for them.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for connecting with me today, Michael. If you enjoyed this episode of the Human Connection podcast, please like, comment, and leave a subscribe. If you want to connect with myself or Michael, check out the links in the show notes. And remember, no matter if your business is B2B or B2C, it's really H to H, human to human. Happy connecting.